Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Jalen, and today I am sharing my top 5 books that were published this year. I ended up dividing up my top 10 of the year between 5 books that were published this year and 5 that are coming out next year, which I'll make a separate video for. But for these, I wanted to talk about the books that are out now that you can go get and why I love them so much and why I feel like they speak to me so much as a reader. Coming in at number 5 is The Guest by Emma Cline. And it seems to me that this book is a little bit divisive, especially in terms of its ending, which is really interesting and I think speaks to the content of this book. But basically, Emma Cline has been one of my favorite writers since back in 2016. I actually made my first ever Bookstagram post on my personal book account for The Girls, which was everywhere back in 2016. And ever since then, I've been following her very closely, and I just love her work so much. And in this novel, it is a deeply suspenseful and voyeuristic account of a young woman named Alex, who is in Long Island, and she is fleeing a man, and she's trying to basically survive throughout the course of the novel by going into various people's homes, flitting between various parties, and just trying to keep going despite battling addiction and a past that is traumatic in ways that we don't fully know as the reader. And what I think Emma Cline does in terms of form in this book that is really interesting is how she, in an interview, stated that she tried to apply the tension and propulsion of a short story to a novel-length work and seeing what could happen. And my personal favorite book of Emma Cline's is Daddy, her story collection that came out, I think, back in 2020. And it does feel like she really captured what I love so much about that book, but put it in a novel form, which is really interesting to see her kind of sustain that suspense and that kind of focused tightness that you find in a short story, but applying it to this somewhat short, but still much longer than a short story following Alex. We follow Alex and kind of you're seeing everything kind of spin out. You don't know what she's going to do. She makes really terrible choices, and you kind of see how long she can sustain this pattern of kind of bad behavior. And the ending of this book I will not spoil, but it is probably the most divisive part about this book. One of the most fun things that's happened this year is just talking to other people about the ending and their takes on it and what they think happens. And I will spare you my theory, but if you read this book or have already read it and you'd like to know what I think about it, I somehow was asked to give my theory on the ending for Vanity Fair. So that's live now on Vanity Fair if you'd like to go see my theory on the ending and some others as well. One of the coolest things that's happening this year. So yeah, let me know what you think about the ending in like an email or DM if you follow me on Instagram. But this one was just so propulsive, the perfect beach read. Could not put it down. Think about it all the time in terms of how she kind of just does plot so well in this book, and also just characterization and the way that she matches all of that with these really like astute psychological observations is really fascinating to me. So Emma Cline, she's incredible. Number 4, I have Couplets by Maggie Milner. This is a book that came out earlier in the year, and it is a book that I will not shut up about. I mean, all these books I've been talking about nonstop on this channel, so I bet this top 5 is not very surprising if any of you have followed me before this video. But Maggie Milner's Couplets is a prose poem. It kind of blends poetry with prose, and it follows the story of a young woman who is in a relationship with a man, and she's also kind of fantasizing about queer love and what that would look like for her. And she ends up meeting someone, and kind of her experiments with queerness, polyamory, the prior relationship and how that bleeds over. But also what this book does is try to capture how do you kind of render that experience in form, whether that's through prose, whether it's through poetry, or the couplet, the rhyming couplet in particular. How can you play with all of those things to explore identity and this kind of shiftingness of this time in the narrator's life, and exploring these broad themes of queerness and love, and how do you do that in a new and original way? And I feel like Maggie Milner does that so successfully and in a way that I'd never really read before, and I love this so much. I mean, I don't often read poetry, and when I do, I tend to, as many people say, I find it to be very difficult sometimes to really get into it. I know it's a very broad generalization. I just have a hard time personally with poetry. But this book is just so good because it kind of uses a very intimate and understandable form, which is a rhyming couplet. There's a certain, I guess, maybe predictability in terms of knowing what the form is and seeing it so expressly on the page. So I'll just give you an example of what it looks like, of course. And she also breaks up these sections with prose as well. And you kind of don't know what you're going to get with each poem, but each one kind of speaks to these broad themes. And I will say, poem 1.8 is probably my favorite thing that I read this year. This is like just everything to me for so many reasons, but it really comments on this idea of kind of using literary form to explore these things. and kind of a meta account of the way to write this book. She kind of explores that in that poem, and I thought it was so fascinating, so beautiful. It ends with a couplet. It's just like, it's everything. I actually had Maggie Milner on my podcast called Reading the Room, and we had a really awesome conversation, one of my favorites that I've ever had, and I could just listen to her talk all day because she's just a genius in my opinion. If you don't think you like poetry, or if you're kind of afraid of it, and any of this sounds good to you, I highly recommend you pick it up. And also this cover is lovely and looks great on your shelves, and also Valentine's Day is coming up. It's a perfect book for that. I think this book came out on Valentine's Day or right around it, so I think the paperback will be out by that time, so it's a good time to pick it up if that sounds good to you. Okay, coming in at number 3 is Burnham Wood by Eleanor Catton. This is a book I read back in April, and at the time, I loved it. But I will say, and in the months since finishing it, this book has just kind of gradually worked its way higher and higher on my list of favorite books of the year to now being in my top 5. This book, I think, is so interesting to me because it does something that I hadn't really expected, which is make, kind of a thriller-y book really succeed for me. I have kind of fallen away from reading kind of more traditional thrillers, I would say, or mystery novels, or kind of those that lean into, I guess, genre conventions. And this book absolutely does. It leans into both this kind of ecological thriller and kind of very propulsive, action-packed plot, and also diving into Shakespearean tragedy and kind of paying homage or kind of using that form in this book. But it kind of uses a very modern framework and a very modern sensibility of telling the story, putting those all together with the most gorgeous and just Eleanor Catton eating it up on every single page. The writing is so good. Such high ideas about how you can render character, how you render their goals, their inhibitions, their ambitions, things that kind of set them back. And she uses this 4-character framework in this tragedy to really explore those things and play these characters off of each other as this kind of master manipulator in this plot. And it was just so well crafted, and you can't put it down. And the story will just blow your mind because the ending is just so shocking for many reasons. But basically, this book follows these 4 characters, 3 of whom are affiliated directly, I guess, with this guerrilla gardening group. And so this group is called Burnham Wood, and they commit these acts that are sometimes criminal, sometimes philanthropic, but ultimately with the goal of planting plants and crops wherever people won't notice. And there comes an opportunity where Burnham Wood is able to go onto this land that has been cut off due to a landslide. However, there's another interested party who is an American billionaire named Robert Lemoyne that causes things to go left for many reasons. The kind of leader or main character of this book is named Mira, and she gets involved with Robert Lemoyne, and you kind of see their competing interests, how they're deceiving each other, their own kind of perspectives on what's going on. He is definitely an antagonistic character, but I think what Eleanor Catton does so well is really render a fully fleshed out and very complex and nuanced depiction of a huge villain. And you kind of are shouting at them when you're reading the book, don't do these things. How can you not see this? But it's because she lends this sort of omniscience and this dramatic irony where the reader knows what's going on. You kind of see what's coming before it does. But you kind of see how humans really behave, or how they would really behave in such a situation, and using this very heightened, interesting plot point of having this, perfect opportunity for Burnham Wood to really succeed, and it kind of being upended by a competing party with a lot of money and a lot of evil underpinning him. And I'd never read her before, so I really want to read The Luminaries, which I know won the Booker. It seems very different, so I'm wondering if this book is quite different for her. I haven't done too much research into her history or kind of her influences or anything, so it's kind of my own solitary experience with this one book, but I will definitely be reading more from her, and I'm excited for whatever she has coming next. If you're looking for a literary thriller, that is my number 1 recommendation going forward. It is incredible. Coming in at number 2, to no one's surprise probably, it's Biography of X by Catherine Lacey. How am I going to talk about this book? And I've already talked about it so many times on my channel. I'm what can I say that's new? And how do I summarize my thoughts? Because it's so difficult. But basically, this one follows the story of a woman named CM who is grieving the loss of her iconoclastic, chameleonic artist wife named X. She has now died, and the book is basically CM writing the biography of her wife, who is now deceased. And amidst all of this, X is a very unpinnable, interesting, very mysterious person who CM seems to not really have known that much herself, despite being married to her and being in love with her. What follows is this book is constructed as a biography, but it's really a novel, so it's playing with form, as I mentioned, but it's also a biography told from probably one of the worst parties that could be interested in writing a biography and attempting to do it, which is a grieving widow. And so Catherine Lacey's really playing with that idea of what does it mean to have this woman tell the story of X, who is also a character who doesn't really Many people didn't know much about her because she kept everything so secret. She was constantly shifting identities as an artist. She was always putting on new facades, new appearances. No one really knew who she was. So how can you write an objective biography of such a woman also while you're experiencing such immense grief? And so those are kind of the core underpinnings of this book and why I thought it was so interesting in terms of form, but also Catherine Lacey sets the story in an alternate U.S. history in which the South is basically a new territory called the Southern Territory that is a fascist theocracy that split from the U.S. following World War II. And that is where X's origins lie as well. So there's another complete layer of mystery and this alternate U.S. history that Catherine adds in here as just another layer of fun and mystery into this book. And I was so blown away by how she was able to kind of render this alternate U.S. history in this book that also feels so like intimate and personal in terms of this exploration of queer love and grief, and also exploring kind of how a nation's history plays into identity in many different ways for these characters in this book as well. The book is playing with one of my favorite questions in novels, which is how does a story and narrative manipulate the way that we see the world and the way that we think about things? When something is fiction or when something is nonfiction, how does that kind of change our perception of what we're reading? I will also say that this has some of the best sentences of the year for me. This book is so juicy, and the ending of this book really surprised me. I had tears in my eyes reading it, which I wasn't really expecting while going through. There's so many different chapters following different characters, or kind of like all different like short stories of people that kind of are telling their account of X and what they knew about her and their kind of own their own stories. And aside from that, the ending and how she kind of wraps this all up and the exploration of grief at the heart of this book just really blew me away. I wasn't expecting to be so emotionally moved by it, but I don't know why I'm surprised. Catherine Lacey is one of our best novelists, I would say. It feels ambitious, it feels original, it feels like it's pushing the limits and really feels like something that's fresh, but not too pretentious, I would say. Everything has its purpose, and I feel like it's all intentional. It doesn't feel like it's trying to make this a huge puzzle box just to be kind of interesting and literary and what have you. It all serves a purpose, and it all works and clicks together in a really magnificent way. So I'll also say I had Catherine Lacey on my podcast as well. Just completely mind-blowing. Can't believe I got to talk to one of my favorite writers. So check that out as well if you haven't already. And then finally, coming in at number 1, who was surprised? You probably just saw it. I'm sure none of you are surprised. I've said it many times on the channel. I won't shut up about this book. I love this book. It means everything to me. It is probably the most me book that I've ever read. It feels like Jalen on the page. Someone made the book of my dreams. That is Mr. Bret Easton Ellis in his latest novel, The Shards. What can I say that has not already been said about this book by me on this channel? So I will say my kind of history with reading kind of started with more horror-leaning novels, a la Stephen King, Goosebumps, R.L. Stine, that kind of thing. Also growing up, and still to this day, whenever I watch movies, I will say I watch a lot of slasher films. I don't watch a lot of movies generally, but when I do, it's usually something that's like kind of pulpy, campy, slasher-y leaning. My favorite movie of all time is Scream, and the Scream franchise I love to death. And all of that to say, this book kind of feels like it is speaking to, at once, my literary interests in terms of I love reading autofiction. I love the idea of kind of what an author can do with using themselves and their own identity on the page, but kind of stamping a novel on it, and what does that allow the writer to explore, and what kind of assumptions does the reader make, and how can the author as novelist play with those assumptions and play with reality to make new possibilities. Tying with that, I love just a plotty, suspenseful romp of a slasher, of not knowing who the killer is in the group, of having a threat that's kind of overseeing this group of friends and what's going to happen, what's going to play out. Love that. But also I love a gay, queer novel about longing as well. And this book is all three. I will say it does all those things so well, but basically, to give you a high-level synopsis of this book, it follows a fictional Bret Easton Ellis, who is, I believe, in his 50s at the time of writing this, and he is thinking about his time as a 17-year-old at a prep school in California, and he is attempting to kind of document what happened to him, allegedly, at this time in school. And so we see someone who seems to be Bret, but we know is not because it's a novel, thinking about this, and he sees someone as an adult that makes him think about his past. From there, we see Bret and him kind of exploring this past at the prep school, and this group of friends, and him kind of growing up in this group of very rich, white, privileged friends who are constantly partying and abusing substances and trying to find themselves as young people in LA as well. But there's a new guy that comes to town at the same time, and there is a killer that is stalking LA that is called the Trawler. And instantly, Brett is very fascinated with Robert. He's instantly obsessed with him for many reasons. He thinks that he's hiding something, but he's also sexually attracted to him. He wants to know more about him. And from there, the reader kind of doesn't know who to trust when they're reading it. Do we trust Brett, who's telling this account of his past? Can we trust Robert? Is there something that Brett's not telling us? And from there, we kind of see these friends kind of fall in and out of love with each other. Lots of drama ensues. The mystery of who Robert is and what happens with all of that kind of comes to a head near the end of the novel. This is a long book, and there's a lot of just kind of scene setting, a lot of diving into LA at this time in the 80s, a lot about the music of the time, about driving around, about partying, about queer longing. Lots of sex writing in this book as well is exploring this idea of kind of queer paranoia, very fraught feelings you have as a young queer person, and thinking those through from an adult lens and kind of playing with all of those ideas in the midst of this being a very autofictional telling of with a very famous author who wrote American Psycho, and kind of using even that layer as well. Like the book is told from the perspective of the adult Brett reflecting on his life. So like you have this sense that you can trust him, but as you go on, it seems like you might not be able to. And I will say, kind of underpinning this is just the most fun that I've ever had reading a book. My heart felt like it was on fire while reading this book. I couldn't put it down. I was thinking about it whenever I wasn't reading it. It's a very rare feeling. I love reading. I love many books that I read every year. They make me feel very giddy and excited, but nothing really did it for me the way that this book did. It just spoke to every personal interest that I love. And I'm kind of sad that I finished it because I feel like I'm never going to find something that really does everything that I want it to do in the way that this does. But this is like the best case of an unreliable narrator done so right and so in such a clever and smart and scary way. This book is also deeply horrifying. I feel like I didn't express that enough. In terms of the serial killer backdrop of the story, very deeply unsettling what happens in the story about the murders that occur in this book. Kind of leaning into the more horror screamness that I love as well. But aside from that, just formally, it is so innovative and interestingly constructed as well. So that is my favorite book of the year, The Shards. Man, I love this book so much. I love it so much. It is just so me. That is enough rating on my end. I would love to know what your favorite books of the year are. What are your top 1 through 5 books? I would love to know. If you read these books, I would love to hear what you think about them as well. And yeah, I'll be back with some more year-end wrap-ups type videos very soon, including 5 books that are coming out next year that made my top 10 this year that you should pre-order, have on your radar, that I think you will love very much if you like the books that I recommend on this channel. So anyways, I will catch you all in the next one. Bye.